All rise.
Thank you, please be seated. I think we have Mr. Carr. Come forward, please. And if you could just state your full name for the record.
Jeffrey Philip Carr.
And do you wish to affirm or swear an oath?
Affirm, thank you. I, Jeffrey Philip Carr, sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence I give to this Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please sit down, Mr. Carr. Commissioner Jenkins.
Mr. Carr, can I just explain to you the process this afternoon? You've taken your oath or affirmation. Now what will occur is that I will speak to you about the witness statement which you prepared at our request. Following that, you will be cross-examined by Mr. Lee, who's sitting at the front right bar table. And then after Mr. Lee has asked you some questions, counsel who are appearing for other parties this afternoon will be given an opportunity to ask you questions too. They may or may not take that opportunity. It's entirely up to them. So Ms. Seawood, who is sitting in the middle of the front bar table, she appears for the department, and so she may ask you some questions. Mr. Darmanada, who's sitting at the far left, my far left, at the front bar table, he appears for Crown Perth and associated entities, and he may ask you some questions. Then sitting at the back bar table, we have Mr. Malone, who's sitting in the middle with the beard. Oh no, there's two at the beard with a beard, but anyway, he's the one in the middle with the beard, and he acts for Mr. Connolly, who was a former casino control officer. And then Mr. Sadler is sitting next to him. He's just half arisen. And Mr. Sadler appears for various members of the Gaming and Wagering Commission, or former members of the Gaming and Wagering Commission. After they've been given an opportunity to ask you some questions, it is likely that members of the Commission will ask you some questions to clarify issues that they have. Following that, Mr. Lee may ask you some final questions, and then you will be free to go about your business. If you would like a break at any time, please let us know. Is there any questions you'd like to ask us now before we commence? That's questions about the procedure.
No, nothing about the procedure.
Thank you. So, Mr. Carr, did you prepare a witness statement at the Commission's request when you received the summons to appear?
Yes, I did.
And perhaps we could put that up on the screen so we can identify. And can you look at the screen in front of you? That will be the screen that a number of documents might be put on.
Yes.
Can we have a look at both, or all pages of that, so Mr. Carr can see it and see his signature at the end?
There is one.
Now, is that the statement that you prepared?
That's the statement I prepared. There is one element of it that's time has proved to be false. I said in 11B, in the third paragraph, that I was not aware of junket operators. Until reading media reports from the New South Wales inquiry. Since I wrote that, the Commission has sent me some documents, an agenda and minutes of a meeting that was held of the Gaming and Wagering Commission, at which I was present, at which there was discussion of junket operators. So clearly I had heard of junket operators prior to preparing that statement, and I apologise for the failure of my memory.
Right. So how would you like to change that sentence?
I'd like to delete that third sentence of 11B.
And apart from that deletion, is the information contained in your statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and
To the
belief?
best of my knowledge, yes.
Then the statement of Mr Carr with that last sentence of paragraph 11B deleted will become an exhibit in the inquiry. Thank you, Mr Carr, and Mr Lee will now ask you some questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr Carr, to begin with, I'm going to ask you some questions about your qualifications, experience and work history.
Yep.
Now, I understand that you attended Claremont Teachers College in 1962 to 1963.
Yes.
Thereafter, you taught in various parts of the state, including Geraldton, Katanning and Ardros,
Correct.
up until 1973.
Till 1973, yes.
You also gained a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Politics from the University of Western Australia, and you graduated in 1971.
That would be correct, yes.
Moving now to your political career, you were elected to State Parliament in March of 1974 as the member for Geraldton, and you remained a member of Parliament until you retired in February 1991.
Correct.
In addition to various shadow positions that you held while in opposition, after the 1983 state election, you were appointed as the Minister for Local Government and Minister for Police and Emergency Services. You remained Minister for Local Government until February 1989,
Yes.
and you remained Minister for Police and Emergency Services until February 1986. In addition to those roles, you also at various times up until February 1991 served as the Minister for Mines and the Minister for Fuel and Energy, Midwest and Small Business.
Regional development.
And Regional Development, thank you. In terms of your work as Minister for Local Government and Mines in particular, would it be fair to characterise those portfolios as primarily regulatory in nature?
Local government, yes. Mines, yes. Not entirely, but substantially, yes.
And to what extent, if at all, do you consider that you gained an appreciation for what was required to administer a regulatory agency in your time as a minister in those portfolios?
Well, I certainly learned a lot during that period of time. Whether I learned sufficient to be able to control a body is a different question, but I certainly gained a fair bit of knowledge during my time in those departments.
And I'll come back to your time as Minister for Police to ask you some questions about gaming issues that were dealt with in that time. But for the moment, however, I just want to cover off on the rest of your career prior to joining the GWC in 2008. And when I'm referring to GWC, that's the Gaming and Wagering Commission, but I'll use that abbreviation for brevity.
Yes.
Can you tell the Commissioners what, if any, other roles you had following your retirement from Parliament in 1991 up until you were appointed to the GWC in 2008?
You're talking about government roles.
Whether it be government or the private sector, essentially what you did next.
I didn't do anything in the private sector, but when I retired, I became very much involved with a couple of local sporting clubs. I was, for several years, president of the South Perth Junior Football Club, president, line market, delegate, registrar, just about everything. I also had 3 years as president of Royal Perth Golf Club, a total of, I think, 9 years on the committee of Royal Perth Golf Club. Then I was appointed to 2 other government boards. I was appointed to the Geraldton Port Authority, and I was appointed to the Heritage Council. The other government task that I was given was that I was appointed as chairperson of commissioners of the body overseeing the amalgamation of the City of Geraldton and the Shire of Greenough.
Now, just in terms of those 3 positions, when was it that you were appointed to the Geraldton Port Authority?
I can't give you an exact year. These were all appointments that were made by the Gallop government, so they were in that period of the early 2000s, I guess.
And would that be true for also your time on the Heritage Council and as chairperson of commissioners overseeing the amalgamation of local governments?
The chairperson of commissioners was only about a 6-month task, and that would have been I believe in the year 2007 from March to October or so. The other two positions I would have been appointed to a little bit earlier than that. I was certainly appointed to the Geraldton Port Authority earlier than that. My appointment to the Heritage Council, I think, was about the time that I finished my time at the Geraldton Council, so that would have probably been 2007 or thereabouts. I'm sorry I don't have the exact dates of that. I wasn't expecting you to ask me about them.
Quite okay. So apart from those roles in the various sporting organisations and those three council positions that you've just taken us through, was there anything else that you had done prior to being appointed to the GWC?
Not that I recall that's relevant, no.
Thank you. Just in relation to each of those three appointments that you had, can you explain at a broad level, just so the commissioners have an understanding of what was involved in those roles?
Well, the Geraldton Port Authority was management of the port in general terms, and that involved monthly meetings, it involved a fairly detailed understanding of how the port was operating, what the port's potential was in terms of possible new cargoes, dealing with issues that the port had to deal with, such as the amount of surge that occurs there that causes problems in certain weather conditions, general administration and oversight of the port. The Heritage Council had a range of activities relating to mostly dealing with applications from people who wanted to develop properties that were identified as being heritage properties, and therefore there was the need to be negotiating how much change could be made to a heritage property without destroying the heritage value of it, but at the same time understanding that developers had a right to develop properties. And I think as far as the Geraldton one was concerned, that was, as chairman of commissioners, the commissioners basically did what the council, what an elected council would normally do. Initially, we sat as the commissioners of the Geraldton Council and the Greenock Council separately. Then when the amalgamation took place, we sat as commissioners of the amalgamated body until elections were held in October of that year.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask some questions in relation to your experience in relation to gaming prior to being appointed to the GWC. And you've indicated under point 1 of your witness statement that you have some knowledge and understanding of aspects of gaming policy as a result of your being Minister for Police from 1983 to 1986. And you say in your statement, during which time the government changed the gambling landscape in a major way. Can you just explain to the Commission your understanding of what that landscape was prior to these changes being made from 1983 onwards?
Well, at that time there was no legal gambling in the state, but there were gambling places operating. Houses, as I understand it, mainly in Northbridge, but there were places which did operate, and they were basically allowed to operate, notwithstanding that they didn't have any legal sanction. And that's when we decided that that wasn't an appropriate way for things to be operating, and so we oversaw with the police a crackdown on those illegal gaming places and opened up a range of opportunities for legal gambling to take place.
And when you say they were allowed to operate, these illegal gaming places, is this what you're referring to when you talk about a containment policy in your witness statement?
Yes.
Who was it that made the decision prior to these reforms to allow these illicit gaming activities to continue?
That's a very difficult question, but obviously it's the same issue that existed for a long time with prostitution, where an illegal activity was operating because some people in authority allowed it to happen, and I don't think I was ever in a position of being able to identify a particular person who did. If I'd identified a particular person who did, I probably would have been obliged to draw that to the attention of the Commissioner or the Premier or whoever, but I was never aware of which individual or individuals were allowing those illegal activities to operate, but I think everybody knows that they were.
Mm. And you mentioned that this was taking place primarily in Northbridge.
I understood that some of these illegal places were in Northbridge. Obviously, the Kalgoorlie two-up school was operating at Kalgoorlie. A lot of country race clubs held two-up meetings after race meetings with no legal sanction to do so. And of course, there were even two-ups on Anzac Day, which I guess, again, were technically illegal.
And are you aware of how long this containment policy had been in operation?
No, as long as no, I don't.
All right. And again, you may not be able to answer this question, but are you aware of what the rationale was for why the policy was in operation?
Not really, no. I guess it was simply a matter of it was something that couldn't be stopped, that people in the community would gamble in some way or someplace, and that if you weren't going to have laws to stop it, then there wasn't much you could do but let it happen.
You then go on to explain, also under point 1 of your statement, that gambling was at this time legalised in a number of forms, and you list the establishment of the casino, two-up permits for country race clubs, and community and sporting clubs being able to apply for permits to conduct gambling events. The inverse of the question I was asking before, can you explain to the commissioners at a high level what the rationale was for why this legalisation was now advanced?
Well, the rationale was that there was undoubtedly going to be people in the community who were going to gamble in one form or another. And the view of the government was that we shouldn't be condoning illegal activities. We should be either stamping them out completely, which is, I think most people would agree to be impossible, or to put in place some sort of a framework which those people who wanted to gamble could gamble within.
So moving from that decision paradigm to the actual establishment of the casino, and you explain in your witness statement that you're a member of the Cabinet subcommittee which considered submissions for the original casino licence. Does that mean that your role was to consider not whether or not there should be a casino, but once that decision had been made, to look at the different persons proposing casinos and then to select from those?
That's correct. In fact, it was interesting because initially the government called for expressions of interest for a casino in Perth, and a number were proposed, and I think there was a general view that the Genting Dempster proposal was outstanding, and they wanted to put it on the Burswood site, and the government initially decided to give it to Genting Dempster. And then in the lunchroom after that cabinet meeting, there was an appreciation that they had proposed to use a piece of government land which they hoped would become available, whereas no other proponent had thought that land might be available. So the government adopted a revised decision which was that we will allow a casino at Burswood, but we will reopen expressions of interest so that any proponent who wanted to would put a proposal for what they would build at Burswood. And the task of the Cabinet subcommittee was to assess those applications as they came in and decide which one of those applications we should recommend to the Cabinet to be the selected operator.
What risks, if any, was the subcommittee concerned with in assessing the proposals for the casino?
The work of that subcommittee was primarily in terms of what a casino operator would offer to the state, in terms of what sort of buildings they would provide, what sort of employment they would provide, how their work would improve that particular piece of land, what extra buildings might be provided to the benefit of the state, such as the large indoor stadium and so on. There wasn't really too much consideration at that stage of the, the probity of the proposers. Once we'd made the selection that was the appropriate proposal and Cabinet had agreed with that, It then passed into the hands of the Minister for Racing and Gaming, who may at that stage have been called Chief Secretary, if my memory is right, but passed into the hands of that Minister and his department, who was primarily responsible for negotiating the deal, the arrangements with the proponent. And as part of that exercise, I know that Minister then undertook inquiries through using a police officer to make further inquiries of the probity and reputation of Genting in Malaysia. And I've been provided with another question and answer that took place in the Parliament, in which I indicated that a police officer by the name of Les Ayton was, by arrangement between the Commissioner and Des Dans, sent to Malaysia to undertake work to investigate the probity of that particular applicant.
Well, let me take you now to those documents. So if we can please call up pub.009.001.004. And I think you've just explained to the Commissioners that prior to today, you've received some documents from the solicitors assessed in the Commission, and they're inviting you to take a look at those.
Yes.
If we can have pages 4 and 5 of this document side by side, please. Now, the debate here, as I understand it, is for the consideration and detailed debate for the what was then the Casino Burswood Island Agreement Bill. You're not recorded as taking part in this debate now, but there are some answers on notice and without notice that you give later in the same day. Do you recall whether you were taking part in this debate at the time?
I wasn't involved in the actual debate. Pretty normal procedure in Parliament is that when a bill is being debated, the Minister whose bill it is carries the debate,
Yes.
and it's, while other members are obviously welcome to participate, other government members, it's not normal for other ministers to involve themselves in a bill that a particular member has. Now,
Well, let me just take you then in relation to the specific debate to a particular question that I'll ask you to reflect upon. And that is a question in relation to the security of the casino that was being discussed. You may have had a chance to look at this already. It starts on page 960 of the Hansard, where there's some remarks from the Honourable Mr Pearce, and there's a question that's asked of the Minister of Education, who I think was leading the debate, and he's asked about the security systems that will be installed at the casino,
Yes.
and whether those will be of high quality. And then across into 961, there's an answer by the Honourable Mr Pearce, in the course of which he contrasts the security at the casino with the security at the Argyle diamond mine. And he then goes on to say that the security system must ensure that there is no winning at the casino as a result of corruption, and it must be secure from being defrauded. Do you recall these debates, whether in the chamber or more broadly going on at the time, and the discussion behind the casino security systems?
I think it's likely that I would have been in the chamber, because I was, in parliamentary terms, a good sitter. I was someone who used to spend a lot of time there when others perhaps would find a reason not to. And I, without being certain, I would have expected that I would have been in the chamber when that discussion was taking place. Bob Pearce was the minister representing the minister, the relevant minister in charge of the legislation was Des Dans, who was in the upper house of the Parliament. Bob Pearce was the member representing him in the lower house and carrying the responsibility of that bill in the Assembly.
So just zooming in on the question of the casino security, did you have any interest in the level of casino security in your role as Minister for Police?
Not directly. Obviously, I had a general interest, obviously, in what was happening in the casino, and a general interest in anything that the police would be involved in. But I was of the view that, well, the reality was that responsibility for the casino legislation was with the relevant minister.
Were you aware at this time, that's back in 1985, of whether WA Police were in any way concerned with security risks to the casino, and if so, what?
Nothing was ever said to me to suggest that they were concerned about security generally. You've seen the other question and answer where I
Yes.
was asked about the sending of the officer to Malaysia.
And I'll bring that up in just a moment.
Okay.
Before we go to that, we're talking generally about security issues. Do you recall at this time, in 1985, whether there was any discussion about the risks of money laundering in the casino.
Not a lot. In general terms, there's an understanding that where lots of money changes hands in places like that, there are risks. There's always a general understanding of that. And I know that's why we wanted to have some integrity research done on the proponents that we'd selected, because of the fact that, there could be risks. I'm not aware of any suggestion that the proponent posed a particular risk.
All right, now moving then to a further extract from Hansard, that's pub.0009.001.001, and if we can please have pages 1 and 2 side by side. Now, I think these are the questions and answers that you were referring to earlier. So at 328 on the left-hand side, you're asked some questions about an officer of the WA Police Force undertaking some investigations, and then you've already mentioned that company's name, Genting Berhard. And in answer, you gave a brief summary as to the investigations that were conducted by Sergeant Ayton. So I appreciate this is a very long time ago, but do you have any recollection now as to what were the matters that were being investigated by Sergeant Ayton as part of these inquiries?
No, and I don't believe I was even given detail at the time. I knew that there'd been an arrangement arrived at between Minister Dans and the Commissioner for Sergeant Ayton to go to Malaysia, and I knew that there were a couple of things that he wanted to follow up more closely, and I was advised of that, but that's about the extent that I was involved in that.
And in terms of what you were advised, do you have any recollection as to whether what you were advised concerned these broader questions that I was talking about before, risks of money laundering in the casinos?
No, I don't have. In fact, not only do I not have a recollection, I'm fairly certain that I wasn't told the detail of what was being investigated. Just that one of the officers from the police was doing this work for another minister.
Thank you. Commissioners, I tender those two excerpts.
The excerpts from Hansard identified respectively as pub.0009.0001.0004 and pub.0009.0001.0001 will be admitted into evidence as an exhibit.
Thank you. The next thing I'm going to ask you about now is the process by which you came to be appointed to the GWC. And you explain under point 2 of your witness statement that you were initially appointed for 3 years and then reappointed for a term of 1 year after that.
Yes.
Can you explain to us how it was that you came to be appointed? So, for example, did you nominate for the role or were you approached?
I was approached by the Minister of the day, Liliana Ravlich, who asked me if I'd like to be appointed to that particular board, and it was only a very brief conversation. She indicated that she was looking for a community representative or someone to represent the community interests, and obviously she thought I was a suitable person for that.
Was there any discussion prior to your being appointed as to whether there were any other qualifications that were needed? You've already mentioned the aspect of being a community representative, but was there any discussion about any particular skills or abilities that you should have as a member of the GWC?
I said to her that I didn't have any particular skills relating to the casino, and that was when she made the comment that she was really looking for someone to represent the community interests there.
And before you accepted the offer to become a member of the GWC, did you have an opportunity to talk with any of the existing members as to what the role entailed?
No.
And are you aware of how it was that you became considered for the position? So I understand what was explained to you when you were approached, that you'd be a community representative, but do you know how it was that your name was first thought of?
The short answer is no. The only thing I can think of is that the minister was the same minister, she was also Minister for Local Government, who had appointed me for that other 6-month job in Geraldton in the preceding year, and she and her department, as I understand it, were pretty happy with how I'd handled that. So I guess I was in her mind as somebody who would be capable of representing the community.
And prior to being approached by the minister, Did you have any understanding of what it was that the GWC did?
Not a lot. No.
Had you heard of the body before?
I'd been aware of the establishment of the Casino Control Board and that sort of thing in the early days. I wasn't really aware that the name had even changed.
And did the Minister provide you with an explanation as to the sorts of things that you would deal with if you decided to become a member of the GWC?
No, it was just that reference to community representation.
Are you aware of whether any other persons who were already members of the GWC were consulted on your appointment prior to you being approached? And this perhaps flows out of what you had said before, that you knew about the body, but essentially only that you knew about it. Is it the case that you had a broad understanding of what the GWC did, or that you didn't particularly have an idea as to what role it fulfilled at all?
I think I had a broad understanding of supervision of gambling without having a detailed knowledge of the exact way that the body operated.
So at that broad level, so there's a supervision of gambling, what was your understanding as to why it was that that supervision was undertaken? What was the purpose for which the GWC was supervising?
Well, I guess it went right back to the original decision that we would legalise gambling. If we're going to have legalised gambling, then there needed to be some form of oversight of the general processes of that.
I'm going to ask some questions now about your induction and training, or the extent of any of those. Once you were appointed to be a member of the GWC, do you remember meeting with anyone to receive an induction and to have someone explain to you what the organisation did?
I don't remember meeting anyone prior to the first meeting that I attended.
Do you recall whether anyone provided you with any materials before your first meeting, such as, for example, copies of legislation, annual reports, or similar?
I'm not sure. I've tried to think whether I was or not, and I'm not quite sure whether I was ever given anything or not.
In relation then to the possibility of training, I think you've said at point 3 of your witness statement on page 1 that you don't recall being given any training. Do you recall any other members of the GWC receiving training?
My recollection is that I was the only new member at that time. I think all of the rest were continuing, so there was no joint training or anything like that for a group.
And you just mentioned that you were the only new member joining.
I think I was.
Did you have any assistance from the existing members? So, for example, did any of those members sit you down to talk with you as to what the GWC did and how you might perform your role? No,
but I would say that during some of the earlier meetings, as issues came up, there would be a little bit of a tendency for explanations to take place. So, an issue would come up that I wasn't aware of, and I'd ask what's this about, and the chairman in particular and other members were helpful in sort of acquainting me with the issues.
And who was the chairman at this time?
Barry Sargent.
So you didn't ever receive any training. Do you recall ever seeking any training?
I don't think I asked for anything, no.
And do you recall whether it was ever indicated to you that there was any training available?
I don't recall anything being said about training being available.
Another of the witnesses that have been before the Commission has mentioned that they, on occasion, attended meetings of the GWC at the casino, at which stage they sometimes saw other casino staff receiving training. Did you ever observe such training taking place?
I certainly attended meetings at the casino. I saw a media report that said we had every second meeting there and got refreshments there, so I checked my own diaries, and during the 4 years I was on it, I can identify attending 3 meetings at the casino, and yeah, there may have been a meeting where we saw some training taking place. I think that's right.
All right, but did you ever yourself receive training in relation, for example, to gaming operations from the casino, or you just observed training taking place?
I didn't receive any training from the casino, but I do seem to recall now that you've mentioned it that on one of those visits that we witnessed some training taking place with their own staff.
You say under point 11B of your witness statement that there was no focus on how gamblers came to be in possession of their money, and any criminal involvement was seen as being a matter for police attention, and you thought that there was communication between the department and the police. Just in terms of how that idea or how that understanding came to form, was that something that was told to you by other members of the GWC when you joined, or is that your view as a result of, for example, reading legislation?
It's more a presumption than anything else. I was aware of the original cooperation between the police and, Des Dans and Les Ayton, and I saw where he had been seconded to Minister Dan's department at one stage and so on, and I guess I just let the presumption continue that there would be close cooperation. There were references in meetings to matters that had been referred to the police by the casino, where they had a need on occasions to call the police to deal with incidents that were beyond their, the normal things. And I just simply presumed, and perhaps I should have done more than presume, but I did presume that there was a continuing liaison and cooperation with the police and other law enforcement agencies.
So on that point about there was no focus on how gamblers came to be in possession of their money, did you understand that potential criminal involvement in casino gaming, and in particular the use of the casino for money laundering, was not a matter that concerned the GWC?
The Commission seemed to regard that as somebody else's responsibility, namely law enforcement agencies generally.
And when you say the Commission seemed to have that view, or that's how they seem to regard it, how did you come to form that view as to what the Commission thought?
I don't recall there being discussions in which it was suggested to us that this was our responsibility.
So is it more that there was an absence of discussion rather than a positive statement? Is that your recollection?
That's probably a fair comment.
I'm then going to ask some questions in relation to the processes of the work of the GWC. You say under point 6 of your statement that the Commission normally met monthly for a half day, the agendas were provided in advance, and you took some hours to study them closely. That's the only part of your statement which specifically describes what you did as part of the GWC. Was the work of the GWC limited to those monthly meetings while you remember?
In the main it was. I do remember a special meeting that we had that I referred to there, where there was an issue of the casino excluding a patron who they regarded as a problem gambler and were wanting to exclude him for his own benefit, and he appealed against that to the Commission, and we had a separate meeting of the Commission to hear his appeal. Apart from that, the meetings were pretty consistently monthly. There may have been a special one sometime for some issue that was urgent, but I don't recall it being other than regular monthly meetings.
So the work of the GWC was confined to meetings, whether they be monthly or sometimes special meetings, is that correct?
Primarily, yes.
And just in relation to those meetings, how did you receive agendas for them?
Okay, it changed during my time. And initially, they were in a paper form, folder, substantial folder, which was delivered to my home a few days before the meeting. During the time that I was there, a change was made to issue us all with an iPad, which was apparently in some way, I was going to say doctored, but apparently in some way set so that it could only be used for Commission business. And so the agenda was emailed to each of us a few days before, and we worked from the iPad as our documentation for meetings.
And in addition to the actual agenda itself, were you provided with any other documentation prior to meetings?
Well, the agendas often had attachments to them, and in some cases substantial.
And what those attachments comprise of?
Oh, it depends what the issue was that was, was on the agenda.
So if you can give some examples for the commissioners just so they can understand usual run-of-the-mill type things that you might receive with an agenda?
Well, there was one that was sent to me in the last couple of days by this commission relating to the definitions of poker machines against electronic gaming machines, and there was an attachment there that detailed a previous decision, a previous policy that had been set at some stage, and so that was an attachment that related to that agenda item.
Who wrote the agendas?
Someone within the department. I don't know the answer to that.
Did you ever write the agendas or contribute items to be included in the agendas?
Not that I recall.
Can you recall whether any other GWC members ever wrote the agendas or provided items to be included in the agendas?
We may have at some stage, somewhat, any one of us may have said that's something we'd like to talk about in more detail at the next meeting, but certainly nothing beyond that, and certainly no one writing the agendas. The agendas were always prepared within the department.
So would it be fair to say that the GWC essentially worked on the basis of considering those matters that were put before it?
Primarily, yes.
Did you ever meet with other GWC members or discuss with those members prior to meetings the items that were coming up in the forthcoming meeting?
I don't think so, no.
Are you aware of whether any GWC members had such discussions between themselves, not necessarily involving you?
Not that I'm aware of.
In terms of the reports or recommendations that may have been with the agendas, are you aware of who wrote those?
Well, the particular example that I quoted to you had had the name of the officer who had prepared that agenda item.
And in terms of that officer, for example, or more broadly other officers, are you aware of whether those officers were officers of the GWC or of any other body?
I think the line between officers of GWC and officers of the department was a line that I probably never quite understood. I tended to regard all of the officers of the department as being officers of the GWC as well.
And when you say the department, are you referring to the Department of Racing, Gaming and Liquor?
As it was then, yes.
As it was then, thank you. Did any of these officers, whether they were GWC or departmental officers, did any of them ever address the meetings of the GWC?
Oh, yes, yes. Depending on what the issues were, the relevant officers were often there. Well, Barry Sargent was always there, of course, as chairman. There was another officer, Sandy Del Pratt, I think, was a relatively frequent member on various matters, and sometimes another member might have been brought in to deal with, to speak to a particular issue.
And how did that come to pass? Was it the case that the officers themselves would think in advance that they should be present for a particular item, or would they be requested to attend by the GWC and then attend at the following meeting? What was the process?
Probably a bit of both. Mainly, I would have said it would have been the chairman who would have thought that it was appropriate to have an officer there to speak to something. And
to the best of your recollection, did you ever have an opportunity to speak with any of the authors of these reports prior to the meeting at which those items might be considered? And likewise, are you aware of whether any other GWC members did so?
Don't know.
In terms of the recommendations that were put before you as part of the agendas that you would receive, do you recall whether the GWC ever determined to reject the recommendations that had been made by officers?
We certainly would have referred some back or deferred some for more information. No immediate rejection comes immediately to mind, but certainly we had deferrals.
And in terms of the deferrals, what would the process for that be?
Simply to record in the minutes that we had deferred the agenda and had deferred the item and wanted more information at the next meeting.
And then in terms of wanting that more information, would you ordinarily then receive further information at the next meeting?
So the next agenda would deal with the issues that we asked them to deal with.
And in situations like that, would it typically be that once additional information had been provided, the GWC would then ultimately adopt the recommendation? or not?
Well, we didn't adopt every recommendation that was put to us entirely. We quite often made slight amendments to recommendations at times.
And can you tell the commissioners how the process of the meeting worked in respect of each individual item? So, for example, did the chairman read the new agenda item and then invite each person to speak to it, or did members only speak to it if they had a particular interest in it? What was that process?
I think it was a process basically of going around the room, of the chairman inviting anyone to speak, and anyone who wanted to speak had an opportunity. There was absolutely never an occasion that I can recall where any member was prevented from having an opportunity to speak.
And did the items ever get put to a formal vote?
Very rarely, if ever. It was almost always a consensus type meeting, consensus type decision making.
And how often, if at all, did the items on the agenda give rise to serious divisions of view amongst the different members of the GWC?
Not a lot. I think it's fair to say that the members of the Commission were people who were all consensus building type people, and while we might have had a few different views on a few different things, we were always able to resolve any differences.
And then at, again, point 6 of your witness statement, you say that the GWC normally met monthly for a half day. And is that your estimate of the average length of a meeting?
Yeah. We normally met at 8:30 and they'd normally be finished by midday.
And was the length of the meeting broadly consistent for the entire 4-year period that you were a member of the GWC, or did they go up or down over that time?
Oh, substantially similar. You know, they weren't all the same, but they were substantially similar.
I'm now going to ask you some questions about the type of work that the GWC carried out as opposed to the process by which it did. You say under point 11A of your witness statement that the Commission's policies and procedures regarding the casino were aimed at ensuring that it complied with legislative and regulatory requirements and that the focus was on day-to-day operations. Is that right?
Yes.
And then you also at a later stage explained that the GWC was concerned with things like problem gambling, number of gaming machines and the location of ATM machines. That's right? Given your prior experience with other regulatory bodies and on other committees that you have been on, how did this focus, this operational focus of the GWC compare to those other committees?
It was a bit different because the two other agencies that I'd been on were agencies where the board or the committee were dealing primarily with our own staff, whereas here, the agency that I was on was dealing with outsiders and needing to, Crown in particular, but other operators, and we needed to have discourse with them, and a lot of that took place in the form of expecting them to report to us on matters that we wanted them to report to us on. So it was different in that regard.
And in terms of the particular focus on, if you like, operational day-to-day matters, was that the same in those other committees that you were involved in, or did they have a more strategic approach?
Well, the Port Authority that I was on clearly had a strategic approach in that it needed to be looking at where its future tonnages were coming from and what needed to be done to accommodate them and so on. So there was a more strategic approach there, less so with the Gaming and Wagering Commission, where it was seen to be a matter of simply overseeing the system that was in place.
Now, the Commission's received various agendas and minutes from the GWC in answer to a notice to produce. I'm going to show you what appears to be the earliest minutes that we have for a meeting that you attended. Can we please call up DLG.002.002.001? You can see that the heading of the document suggests it's a meeting on 27 January 2009.
Yes.
And you can see that you're listed as being present at that meeting.
And I also
And I should clarify, this is just the earliest documents that we, the Commission, have. I'm not suggesting that this is the first meeting that you attended.
I've said in my statement that after looking at my diaries, my first meeting was on the 29th of January 2008.
Yes, but the Commission has requested documents from various persons, and they requested documents covering certain timeframes. So this is the first minutes that we appear to have which show you being present at a meeting.
Okay.
I'm not suggesting that this is the first one that you were at as a member.
Okay. That's okay.
But do you recognise the format of these minutes, how this appears?
Yes.
And you mentioned before that these meetings would ordinarily begin at 8:30, and I think you can see that in the first paragraph under the apologies, that it mentions it opened at 8:30. And if we can go to page 5, please. You can see that it closes there at 11:10 a.m.
Okay.
So a bit over 2.5 hours. Would that have been, a reasonably usual meeting length?
Yeah, any time between 11 and 12 probably would have been the range.
So if we can go back to page 1, please. You can also see when we get there in the heading that it was conducted at the
At Burswood.
Yes, Swan Room lobby floor. And again, I think you told us earlier that this was only one of perhaps 3 occasions where you did appear at the casino.
I went through my old diaries to try to identify how many meetings we had attended at Burswood, and I only found 3. So unless I've made a mistake somewhere, then that's 3 in 4 years.
On those occasions where you were not at the casino, where did the GWC meet?
In the departmental offices in the Hyatt building.
And was that, apart from those casino instances, was it always at that building?
Yes, the special hearing that we had that I referred to earlier about the problem gambler was held somewhere else. I think that may have been in the Fire Brigade board little amphitheatre or some other building, but it wasn't in the Hyatt or at Crown.
Now, earlier you made a comment that you had seen in the media some comments to the effect of the GWC meeting at Crown and receiving refreshments. On those 3 occasions that you did meet at the casino, was it the case that, to the best of your knowledge, you received refreshments from the casino?
Nothing beyond water on the table.
And are you aware of whether it was the case that the GWC was paying to make use of the facilities of the casino? Is that something that you weren't aware of?
I certainly wasn't aware of that, and the occasions that we met there were basically when the casino wanted to show us something, whether they had, for example, a change they wanted to make to one of their gaming floors to turn it into a high roller room or something that they wanted to do differently. And so they would invite us to meet there for that reason mainly. There was once we met there when they wanted to show us a couple of very elaborate apartments that they'd built for high rollers, and so they showed us that. So I presume we didn't pay. I presume they were happy to have us there to show us something that they wanted to show us.
Okay, now going back to the agenda, the first item showing, if we can zoom back out please, is confirmation of the previous minutes, and then there's disclosure of pecuniary interests, and then prior matters being actioned. Going to page 2, with then 3 applications for persons to be approved as casino employees at agenda items 4.2 to 4.4. Now the minutes for that seem to indicate that those 5 people appeared and they provided a brief background of circumstances leading to listed offences and then responded to queries raised by members. And you can see in the box below that after that there's a resolution to issue casino licences to those persons. I'll just give you a chance to read that quickly and confirm that you agree with that summary.
It sounds consistent, yes.
Was it common for the GWC to be involved in the issuing of casino employee licences to persons?
It did happen, yes.
And if so, how much time might the consideration of a matter like that take up in a meeting?
Well, long enough for someone to come in to answer any questions that we had about them and to depart. Not a huge amount of time, but long enough to assess what needed to be assessed.
If we can please bring up pages 3 and 4 now of this document, have them side by side. So you can see that item 6.1, there was a matter concerning a bookmaker. Obviously that's been redacted, but you can see the resolution under that item on the next page to give that person an opportunity to show cause why there should not be the exercise of disciplinary powers. And again, my question, is it common for the GWC to be involved in those sorts of matters as to whether or not there should be the exercise of disciplinary powers?
It did happen on more than one occasion, yeah.
And again, in terms of the amount of time that would take, was that a particularly lengthy process or was it reasonably efficient?
A lot would have depended on the circumstances of the particular case that we were having to consider. Sometimes it could have been dealt with fairly quickly, sometimes it was a little bit more, requiring more information.
And you can see we've got item 7, which is essentially noting and advice. And then we go down to item 9, which is the next substantive item, demonstration of a spinning reel machine. And there's a comment there as to the director compliance demonstrating the distinguishable features between spinning reel machines and proposed electronic gaming machines. What was the process that the GWC undertook when carrying out an assessment as to what a machine type was?
Well, on a number of occasions, Crown brought machines into the departmental offices and demonstrated them there in our presence. I might say that the whole issue of the differences between poker machines and electronic gaming machines was an extraordinarily difficult issue, and I know you've sent me some more copies of some papers last night concerning this particular subject. It was a very difficult issue, but normally, in answer to your question of how it was presented to us, they would normally bring the machines in and demonstrate them. And
I'll just call up an example of an agenda which shows that. So that's GWC.002.0016.0034. This is an agenda for a meeting that was held on the 22nd of March 2011. And item 4.4, as you can see down there, deals with card symbols on electronic gaming machines. And then we can please bring up GWC.002.0016.0040. And these are the minutes for that meeting, which you'll see in a moment. And again, they have you present at that meeting. If we can now return, please, to the previous document, the 0034, and go to page 20. And I think you've explained that you have received a copy of this from the solicitors assisting the Commission. Have you had a chance to read this report since receiving it?
yes, I have.
And do you agree that the report which is provided along with this document essentially goes through and explains the history of poker machines and then provides guidance as to how to tell the difference between poker machines and EGM?
Yes.
If we can go to page 28, please. There are 5, if you like, steps that are provided there as suggested guidance for determining whether a machine's a poker machine or not. Are these the steps that you actually applied when a member of the GWC in assessing such games?
I'm not sure it was presented to us in quite those terms, but as I said, this was one of the great difficulties because I think we know the history that poker machines are illegal in WA, and that was decided a long time ago when it was very easy to define a poker machine and what wasn't. And since then, there's been a huge amount of effort by various agencies to invent electronic gaming machines, which are very, very, very similar to poker machines. And in turn, poker machine operators have been remodelling their poker machines to look more like ECGs, electronic gaming machines, so that we have, with all the technological change that's taken place, it is extremely difficult to draw a line between the two. And we in the state continue to say we have no poker machines in the state, but we have machines at Burswood which are almost identical to poker machines. We have looked at trying to find them, and I noticed the paper that you had referred to the paper that was sent to me referred to a policy that was adopted in 2005, but further on in one of the other papers that was sent to me shows the minutes of a 2011 meeting referring to a policy that was adopted in 2010. So obviously there's a bit of a discrepancy there. But the main things we looked at were the main difference is how long it takes for the machine to provide a result, a minimum of 5 seconds for an electronic gaming machine, whereas a poker machine produces a result in 1 to 2 seconds. There was a requirement that the player have some input in an electronic gaming machine compared with the poker machine where you just press the button. So the delineation is very, very difficult.
You've stressed that on a few occasions now that this is quite a difficult task to undertake. Can I infer that it was also quite a time-consuming task when the GWC was asked to consider these machines?
Yeah, it did take some time, and of course, as I said earlier, in each case there would be a machine there that we would actually watch in operation for a little while as well.
So thinking back now to the agenda that we looked at before, which was DLG 0002, 0002, 0001, and the items that were on that agenda, there was the consideration of the grant of a licence, consideration of disciplinary issues, and consideration of the machine that I've taken you to in each instance. Would it be fair to say that the lion's share of time in relation to that meeting was taken up by operational day-to-day matters?
The lion's share of most meetings was taken up with operational day-to-day matters.
And
I should say that's as far as the casino is concerned, and not forgetting that a fair chunk of the meeting would also be taken up with a range of other non-casino gambling issues.
And on that point, how would you characterise, very roughly speaking, the breakdown between the amount of time the GWC spent on the casino and the amount of time it spent on other gaming activities?
Well, it clearly varied from meeting to meeting depending on what was on the agenda.
If you could hazard an estimate over time?
Hazard a guess. The casino was always seen as, the big ticket item, therefore needing to be given as much attention as it could be. But all of the other things were also seen as important. And we had this continuing little hassle during my time as well with over community gaming permits, where two poker leagues, the Australian Poker League and the WA Poker League, were each trying to exploit those community permits so that they would seek approval to run a gaming tournament over a period of time in a number of hotels, but do that by saying that they're running community gaming evenings. And so that was always inclined to take a little bit of time as well.
Thank you. Commissioners, I seek to tender those documents. That's DLG.0002, 0002, 0001, GWC 0002, 0016, 0034, GWC 0002, 0016, 0040.
Those three documents are admitted into evidence as exhibits. Sorry.
Now, just one other question, Mr. Carr, again at a high level. We've talked a fair bit now about operational matters that the GWC was involved in. Do you have any sense as to how much time the GWC spent on higher level issues such as strategy, development of policy, consideration of advice to ministers?
No, I don't think I can answer that.
Were those sorts of matters that I've just referred to, were they commonly considered by the GWC?
The GWC was more focused on what was in front of us on a day-to-day basis.
Moving then now to some questions about the relationship between the GWC and the department. And you've already mentioned that you're not entirely clear as to the line between officers of the department or the GWC. But you say under point 12 of your witness statement that you understood the department's role as being to provide reports and recommendations to the Commission and to carry out day-to-day administration in accord with Commission policies.
Yep.
When you refer to reports and recommendations in that paragraph, are you referring to the reports and recommendations that would be provided along with the agendas prior to meetings?
Yes.
And then when you refer to day-to-day administration, what did you understand to be included in day-to-day administration?
Well, I guess anything that came up.
In particular, did you have any understanding that there were inspections being conducted on behalf of the GWC?
I understand there were inspections, yes.
And what was your understanding of those inspections?
That they were to see that the casino staff were or the casino and casino staff were complying with the regulations.
Did you have any knowledge while you were a member of the GWC as to, for example, how many persons had been appointed to act as inspectors or under what conditions they had been appointed, such as, for example, their wage, whether they were part-time or full-time?
No, I didn't.
And in terms of staffing, again, you've already explained that the line perhaps was not clear between departmental and GWC staff. Were you aware of any persons which you considered to be primarily GWC staff people?
No, not really.
And to what extent, if any, did the GWC exercise oversight or control in respect of persons who were discharging functions on behalf of the GWC?
Not a lot. Our chairman was in fact the head of the department, and I think we presumed that anything that required action was being dealt with by him.
So is it fair to say then in respect of that answer that the departmental head would deal with actions that were required, that you understood essentially that the department, some way, would undertake the necessary work that the GWC required to be done?
Yes.
You also say under point 12 of your witness statement that you were surprised that the departmental head was also the chairman.
Yes.
And then you go on to say that it's unusual structure, but it didn't cause any problems during your time as a member.
Yes.
Can you tell the Commission why you say that this sort of structure is unusual and what sort of problems you think it may have caused?
Okay, well, I was Minister for Local Government for 6 years and saw the local government model where the town clerk is ex officio present at the meeting but not voting. I saw the same in the two other boards that I was on, the Heritage Council and the Geraldton Port Authority. I was president of a significant sporting club in Perth where the same thing prevailed. It always seemed to me to be a good logical basis that there should be a separation between the doers, the department or the agency, and the committee or board or commission overseeing it. It always seemed to me to be a logical model, and I was surprised that we didn't have that model here. As you say, I've emphasised that it didn't cause a problem because of the professionalism of Barry Sargent. And I'd also make the comment, I guess, on the other side that changing the structure to have a different structure wouldn't guarantee that you wouldn't have any problems, depending, of course, on the professionalism and personalities of the people involved. But the structure that separates the two makes a lot more sense to me.
Thank you. I'm going to ask some questions now about the role of the Chief Casino Officer, which I'll refer to as the CCO for brevity. You haven't mentioned the CCO in your witness statement. Are you familiar with that role?
In general terms.
What was your understanding of the role of CCO in your time as a member of the GWC?
I took it as him being responsible for the oversight of the regulations and so on by which the casino was required to operate.
Are you aware of whether there was a view within the GWC as to who was responsible for appointing that person?
No.
I'm going to show you a few items of an agenda where the CCO is mentioned and then ask some questions about that. So if we can please bring up GWC.0002.0016.0028. And you'll see from page 1 that it's a GWC agenda for 28 June 2011. Now, if we go down to page 7, you'll see the minutes for the previous meeting. And there at item 5.12, which is at the top of the page, there's a discussion about the GWC having some concerns about a number of incidents which have occurred at the casino, and then tasking the CCO with essentially approaching the casino to discuss those concerns. Do you see that?
Yes.
Was it the case that GWC would regularly task the CCO with these sorts of activities, or was this an occasional thing?
It would be an occasional thing if something came to the attention that needed to be addressed.
And if we can now please go down to page 193 and have 193 and 194 up side by side. And you can see this is a report, just looking at the background there, in relation to the CCO meeting with the casino representatives to discuss an emergency management plan in the lead up to CHOGM. This is in 2011, and you can see it's signed off there by the person as Director Licensing and Chief Casino Officer. Have you had a chance to look at that?
I've skimmed it, yes.
Very good. Looking then again at the fact that this is a report apparently from the CCO, do you recall how often it would be that the GWC received reports from the CCO as opposed to other officers of the department or the GWC?
I would have said it was not very frequently.
So was the majority of reports by other officers, not the CCO? Do I understand that correctly?
That's my recollection.
At a high level, and speaking in general terms, how important did you understand the CCO to be to the operation of the GWC?
Reasonably high.
And on what basis is that answer given? What were the things that you were depending on the CCO for?
Well, if something came to our attention that was happening at Burswood that was not seemed to be in order, as in the previous example that you just put up there, then having the CCO attend to that and deal with that would seem to be appropriate.
Do you know whether the CCO had any role in relation to reviewing the reports or recommendations that were provided by other officers?
No, I don't know.
Commissioners, I seek to tender GWC.002.0016.0028.
That document is admitted as an exhibit.
Moving now to ask you some questions in relation to budgeting issues for the GWC. Can we please call up GWC.002.0016.0022 at page 1? And you'll see that these are the minutes for a meeting of the GWC on 23 March 2010, and that again you were showing as being present in that meeting. Going to page 9, please, and looking at item 10.2, you'll see that the item relates to the budget for 2010-2011. And do you see there that the GWC resolved to approve the budget?
Yes.
Do you recall approving the budget on each of the years that you remember?
I can't be certain of that.
I'll just draw your attention to the fact that there's a discussion above the actual resolution about capital expenditure on software and web development. And then I'm going to go now to the agenda item for the meeting to ask some further questions about that. If we can please call up GWC.002.0016.0002 and go to page 161. And looking here, you can see in the top corner, we've got agenda item 10.2 again. And it appears to be the briefing paper as to the budget that we were looking at a moment ago. Looking under the recoupment to DRGL, there's a paragraph explaining that there's been an increase in expenses of 6.11% following a review of those fees by the department. Do you see that? I'm aware that this is going back a very long time, but do you have any recollection now as to what the explanation was as to how this review by the department had resulted in the determination that there had to be an increase in fees?
Sorry, I can't help you there.
And do you recall whether the GWC were ever given reports to explain financial changes like this, or was it confined to the budget document that we're looking at the moment, if you can recall?
No, I'm sorry.
Not a problem. The next item down, we're looking at capital expenditure, and you can see there's an amount there of $300,000 for a new DRGL online customer payment framework. Now, this can just be brought up a little bit, please, to have that paragraph centred in the screen. And you can see in the final paragraph, there's a discussion about having a single framework catering for GWC and DRGL customers. Do you see that?
Sorry, where's
So under the heading of capital expenditure, other, 300,000.
Yes.
And then there's two paragraphs, and that second paragraph, well, in fact, both paragraphs, make it clear that there's going to be a single payment system for both the department and the GWC. Again, this is a long time ago. Do you have any recollection of this item?
No, I don't.
Just looking at the words that are there in those paragraphs, do you agree that it looks like there's a single system which is going to be used by both department and GWC?
And it's consistent with what I said earlier, which was that I didn't see a huge demarcation between the Commission and the department.
Are you aware of whether the GWC would have, or perhaps would have been likely to, scrutinise the budget to make sure that any monies that it was contributing to an exercise that involved the department and the GWC were not in effect subsidising the department's use of that same project? Is that a sort of exercise that would have been undertaken?
I don't think so, and it does remind me of my days when I was a minister trying to get departmental budgets organised, and the smaller agencies don't have a lot of say in what gets allocated to them in a budget context.
And was that the way that you understood the relationship between GWC and the department, that it was effectively a smaller agency dealing with a larger agency?
Oh, not so much in that example. I see that more as, the two parts of the one agency, really.
If we can please go to page 163 now. So you can see here we've got some figures being presented as to the GWC budget, and on the left-hand side there are two headings to those columns: operating expenses and revenue from services. And under the revenue from services, one of the items that we have there is the casino gaming licence fee. It's the first item. Do you have that?
Yes.
What did you understand that licence fee to be?
Just that, the licence fee.
And what did you understand the purpose of the money gained by that fee to be used for?
Well, I think this goes right back to the very beginnings with the establishment of the casino, and you'll remember the debate in papers that you showed me of with Bob Pearce and others in the Parliament debating the payments that were made by the casino to the state. One was for purchase of the land, and one was for basically the benefit that they gain from being allowed to have a licence to operate as a casino. And I'm presuming that that's an annualisation of that. I'm guessing, I know, but that's how I would see it.
Yeah, and in terms of what that money was going to be used for once it had been obtained each year, did you have an understanding while a GWC member as to what that money was to be put, for what purpose?
I would have suspected it would have gone into consolidated revenue more than anything else.
Okay, so you didn't understand it to be the GWC's money to spend as it saw fit. Then if we look under operating expenses, please, there's an item called recoupment for services received from DRGL. And you can see, once that's brought up, you'll see that it increases up to 4.2 million in the estimated budget for the 2010-2011 year.
Sorry, which one was this?
So if we look under the operating expenses heading,
Yes.
we go down to recoupment for services received from DRGL.
Yes.
And you can see that the budget estimate for the coming year is 4.2 million. and the final column on the right.
Yes.
What did you understand, if at all, those monies to be for?
I don't know. I probably knew at the time, but I don't know now.
Did you have any understanding that the GWC contributed money to the department to essentially pay for the department's provision of services such as staff members to conduct inspections?
I was never aware of those sort of financial arrangements.
Looking at the increase in the amount of money each year, so you can see in 2008-9 it's at 3.3 million, and then it goes up to 4.2 million 3 years later. Do you recall any discussion at around this time as to why it was that there was a greater expense year on year being paid by the GWC to the department?
Well, if it was what it says it was, which is services provided by the department, I presume the majority of that would have been wage increases.
All right, and you can see underneath that as well, there's another thing, capital expenses, web design, which has $260,000 in the 2008-9 budget. Did you have any recollection of the GWC ever having a website?
No.
And do you have any idea what that $250,000 approximately relates to?
No. The only thing I can think of is this may have related to when they were organising iPads for us and a system of using iPads for. I don't know. That's a guess off the top of my head.
All right, and the last thing I'll ask you to have a look at is at page 166, please. And you can see these are very similar to what we were looking at a moment ago, except these figures now take us all the way back to 2005-6. So if you look again at the recoupment for services from DRGL, you're at about 2.5 million in 2005-6. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then again, you go through to your 4.2 million in 2010-11.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you to accept when I say that that's approximately a 65% increase in the amount being taken for services between that 5-year period. Again, my question is, do you have any recollection as to what had changed to account for the 65% increase in fees over this 5-year period?
No, I don't.
And do you have any recollection of budget issues such as that being discussed by anyone in the GWC while you remember?
I think the GWC, by and large, had to accept the budget it was given rather than having too much of a negotiating position in regards to budget.
And who was it, to the best of your knowledge, who actually did up the budget? Which person was responsible for coming up with these figures?
Well, ultimately it would be Treasury, with advice from the department, I would expect.
Thank you. Commissioners, I seek to please tender GWC.002.0016.0022 and GWC 002.0016.0002.
The two documents with the identifier numbers just read out by Mr. Lee will be admitted into evidence as exhibits.
The next thing I'd like to ask you about briefly is just in relation to conflicts of interest. And you mentioned in your witness statement under points 15, 16 and 17 that you didn't receive any specific information about conflicts of interest while a member, but you were comfortable that you didn't have any conflicts yourself.
Correct.
And I think you say that you assumed all of the staff of the GWC and the department would have been subject to a conflict of interest policy, but you didn't ever
I didn't
confirm
ever
that.
know and I didn't ever ask, but I did presume that.
Can you recall whether any of the staff of the department or the GWC ever declared a conflict or a potential conflict to the GWC members at a meeting?
I don't remember any staff declaring conflicts of interest, and I can't think of any occasions when other members may have done, although I've got a feeling in the back of my mind that there may have been an example or two of a minor nature.
So just sticking with the employees for a moment, and perhaps not confining ourselves to formal declarations of potential conflicts, did you ever hear in casual conversation with other members of the GWC or other departmental officers about potential conflicts of those staff members, whether they be staff of the GWC or the department? Do you recall now ever hearing of any personal friendships between officers of the GWC or department and employees of Crown Casino?
Not of that time. I've seen the media reports, of course, of more recent times, but at that time I did not hear anything at that time.
And thinking specifically about the position of the CCO for the moment, if it was the case that a CCO had a personal friendship with an employee of the casino, do you consider that's the sort of thing that, as a member of the GWC, should have been disclosed to you?
Oh, yes.
And if a person in the position of a CCO had a potential conflict because of a friendship, and it in some way affected the discharge of their duties, in your view, would it have been possible for that to then impact upon the work of the GWC?
Well, it's obviously a hypothetical question.
Yes.
You would have to consider each case on the merits of what there was. There are ways of handling conflict of interest so long as it's all declared and everyone knows what the position is in some circumstances. So I wouldn't want to give you a blanket answer to that.
All right. My question, as you say, it's a hypothetical. It's not aimed at any actual incident. But I'm trying to get an assessment of the significance or the potential significance if a person, whether consciously or unconsciously, was compromised in discharging their function as a CCO. Do you think that is the sort of thing which might have an impact on the GWC, or do you not think that is likely to have any impact on the GWC's operations?
Oh, it certainly could have done. If there was such a conflict of interest, it should have been declared and known about, and then the Commission should have been in a position to make whatever decisions it considered appropriate in response to that information.
I'm just going to ask some questions now about delegations and what you understood to be the position with delegations of the GWC. To begin with, as a broad question, what is your understanding of the effect of the delegation of a statutory power? So once a delegation is made, which persons are able to then exercise that power thereafter?
Well, the person that it's delegated to, I imagine.
And is it your understanding that only that person can then can then exercise that power, or can the person or body who delegated the power continue to exercise that power?
Well, power can be delegated to a position, and if a different person comes to occupy that position or to act in that position, then I would expect that the delegation would be valid.
So putting it in more concrete terms, if the GWC delegated a particular power to, for example, the CCO, thereafter, is it your understanding that only the CCO can exercise that power, or that both can exercise that power, both the GWC and the CCO?
You mean once we delegate the power, we remove it from our own position?
What I'm trying to understand is, what was your understanding? Was it the case that you did remove it, or was it the case that you continue to hold that power as well?
My general understanding of delegation is that when a body delegates power to another person, to a person to act on their behalf, they still have an oversight role of the decisions made by the delegate.
And how is that oversight role exercised?
Well, again, it depends on the circumstances.
In the particular circumstance of the GWC, and perhaps to make sure that I'm asking this question fairly, do you recall delegations being made by the GWC to other persons?
In general terms, but I can't recall a specific case.
I'll take you to a specific example in a minute, but you can recall that occurring in the past.
Yes.
And you mentioned before that there was an oversight function.
Yes.
How is that oversight function, how did it work when the GWC made delegation?
I would think it would have the power to review the decision made by the delegate.
And as a matter of practice, was it the case that when persons to whom the GWC had delegated powers exercised those powers, the GWC was then subsequently told about the exercise of those powers?
I don't know. I don't recall.
Don't recall. Do you recall there ever being meetings of the GWC in which you were told about powers being exercised by delegates?
Not a specific recollection, but it sort of rings a bell, if I can say that.
Mm-hmm. If we can please bring up GWC.0002.0016.002, and we'll show page 2, please. And you can see that we've got an agenda item here, 8.1, with a recommendation, and point 2 of the recommendations deals with the Commission delegating approval of exemptions to the Director and Deputy Directors of Licensing. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we can now go, please, to page 4, you can see when it comes up, you'll see the actual proposed instrument of delegation. And you can see there from the striking out an amendment of some text that it looks like this has been a markup of a prior delegation. Looking at the top of the page, you can see some changes to the title.
Yes.
And then lastly, if we can please go to page 6 of this document, you can see at the bottom of the page what appears to be the proposed insertion of a power to capture what we were looking at a moment ago in the recommendation box.
Yes.
Do you see that?
Yes.
So in terms of the delegation that we're looking at now, does that ring a bell in terms of the sorts of things that the GWC would make use of as instruments of delegation, or do you not have a recollection of that today?
I certainly don't recollect the details of it, but I'm not surprised to see it there.
Is the format of document that you're looking at something which you are familiar with? If we can go back to page 4, please, just to show Mr. Carr the beginning of that document.
Yeah, I accept that that's the sort of thing that would have happened, yeah.
Do you have, I think you've made it clear that you have no recollection of actually seeing this now. I'll just show you the minutes of the meeting just so you can confirm that you were present at that meeting. So if we can please bring up GWC.0002.0016.004, and we can start at page 9, please. I think you'll see yourself in the list there of present. If we go to page 9, I think that's the starting point. And then page 16 is agenda item 8.1, and you'll see that that is the same language as what we saw a moment ago when looking at the agenda item itself in terms of that resolution and looking in particular at the second dot point.
Yes.
Now, I know this is difficult because you don't have a clear recollection.
It's a long time ago.
Yes, but perhaps you may be able to help the commissioners at a broad view as to what your understanding was as to why delegations such as this were made. What was the purpose for making delegation? If you don't have a recollection, then you don't obviously need to answer that question.
I really can't help you there, I don't think.
Thank you. Moving on.
I vaguely remembered this happening, but no, I really can't help you.
Do you remember any discussions, not necessarily in relation to this delegation, but any discussion generally as to how delegations on behalf of the GWC might work?
Not a lot, no.
The next thing I want to ask you about, actually, before I proceed, I will seek to tender those documents. That's GWC.0002.0016.002 and GWC.0002.0016.004.
The two documents with the identifier numbers that Mr. Lee has just read out will be admitted into evidence as exhibits.
Moving on now to the issue of junket regulation, and can we please call up PUB.0004.005.001. So as this comes up, Mr. Card, this is the Casino Control Act 1984, and if we go to pages 46 and 47, and have those side by side. I just wanted to show you initially Section 25A of the Casino Control Act, which allows for the making of regulations with respect to regulating or prohibiting junkets, and you can see that there in 25A sub 1.
Yep.
Do you recognise this section of the Act, or did you ever see this while you were a member of the GWC?
I think this particular paragraph might have been quoted in the document that was emailed to me previously, the one that involved a report from an officer recommending that the requirements of licensing be removed. That looks familiar to this particular paragraph.
At a high level, what's your understanding as to why it was considered appropriate for there to be a power to regulate or prohibit junkets?
Well, as I said earlier when I was changing my statement, I'd forgotten that I'd ever heard of junkets. And I've been trying to test my memory about the meeting that was referred to in those papers that were sent to me. I know very little about this sort of thing. You know, when we had that meeting, as much as I can recall it, there was a brief discussion about what junket operators are, and they were described to us more or less as something, an agency that puts a gambler together with somewhere that will take gamblers, almost like a travel agent. And I don't think that we saw it as being a lot more than that. Obviously, I'm aware of what's been in the media lately about some of these operators, and I presume it was put in the Act because somebody who knew more about these things than me saw it as a problem.
If we can please call up now GWC.002.0016.001, and you can see at page 1, this says it's an agenda for Tuesday, 23 February 2009. But if you look down...
Just before you do, by the way, I was sent that one, and I was also sent the minutes that purported to be the minutes of the same meeting, dated 23rd of February 2010.
That's just the point that I was going to discuss with you. If you look down the bottom there of the confirmation of the minutes, the first item, and you can see that the first issue is confirming the minutes of the meeting on 15 December 2009.
Okay, yeah.
In those circumstances, does it look to you that the person who put the agenda together has simply used the wrong year at the top, and that should say 2010?
Well, that's how I'd read it. Someone who prepared the agendas working from a template and changed bits to change and didn't change that bit.
Yes. And if we can go to page 3, and I'll ask you to look at agenda item 8.2. And as you can see, it says approval of junket operators and representatives. Now, is this one of the papers that you've had a chance to look at prior to today?
Yes.
And then I'm going to just show you the minutes for the meeting, which is DLG.0002.002.0014. And you can see there we've got minutes for 23 February 2010, with you being present as well.
Yes.
If we go to page 10, please, we've then got the agenda item for 8.2, and you can see that it's simply resolved to accept the recommendation.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned earlier that you have a vague recollection of there being some discussion prior to this taking place and you receiving explanations that junkets were quite similar to travel agents. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, yes. That they were simply operators who brought together somebody who wanted to gamble with somewhere to gamble.
Do you recall who it was that was saying this?
No, it was someone in the meeting, I'm not sure.
Do you recall whether it was a GWC member or whether it was an officer that had come to present to you in respect of the recommendation?
I think it was a member of the commission.
If we can now please pull up GWC.0002.0016.001. And is this the document that you've had a chance to look at that was provided to you by the solicitors assisting the Commission.
Yes.
Now, you will have seen that the document consists of a 10-page memorandum under the name of Nick Toyne and a 5-page letter that precedes that from Mr. Joshua Preston of the casino. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you've already explained that having looked through this, you only have a very faint recollection of the events in the meeting.
Yes.
There are various points made in the documents as to why it's proposed to change the regulations. They essentially fix on there being no need for approvals because there's already Commonwealth Department border checks, and there's some discussion about it being essentially bad for business because there's a chance that junkets might go elsewhere. Do you agree with that summary?
Yes.
Do you have any recollection at the time of the meeting as to whether the GWC members discussed those offered rationale for the changes and whether there was any consideration given to getting more information as to whether those rationales were accurate?
Yeah, I repeat that this is a very hazy recollection, but I think there was an acceptance of the first of those arguments that there were other agencies that were dealing with any issues of criminality, you know, federal agencies, federal police, border control, etc., and that it seemed to be an argument that we could accept, that it didn't need to be us that was supervising this. I don't remember much discussion about the second point about whether there was economic benefit for Crown compared with other operators.
Now, you will have seen that the recommendation there is framed in terms of removing the requirement for junket operators and representatives to be approved by the Commission. You can see that on your screen. If we can please call up pages 343 and 344 side by side. Now, if you look at what I'm going to ask you to accept is Regulation 12 and 16, which are on those 2 pages. Regulation 12 at the time talked of the Commission having the power to require the holder of an approval to give additional information. And you can see then at Regulation 16, there's a general requirement for the Commission to receive notice about a junket prior to a junket taking place. Would you agree that both of those regulations are not actually related to the approval of junket operators or representatives, but instead are relating to notice or information?
Yeah, certainly the 12. It certainly seems to be the case, yes.
If you were to be told that what occurred after the GWC resolved to support that recommendation, that the regulations in their totality were deleted, including those regulations we've just looked at, would you consider that that went beyond the scope of what the GWC had resolved to support?
That certainly surprises me, yes.
In terms of resolutions like this, do you recall whether there was a usual practice to receive follow-ups to tell the GWC what had been done after a recommendation had been adopted?
No, I think there was just the assumption that what we had asked to be done was done.
And again, I appreciate that it's very hazy and it's a long time ago. Do you have any recollection of there being any subsequent follow-up in relation to the junket issue after this paper had been dealt with?
No, I don't.
Commissioners, I seek to tender those relevant documents, which is GWC.002.0016.001, DLG.002.002.014. Just those 2 documents, thank you.
Those 2 documents with the identifiers, identifier numbers that Mr. Lee has just read out will be admitted into evidence as exhibits.
The final thing I want to ask you about now is in relation to problem gambling, which you mentioned in your witness statement. And you say that at point 11A, you said that one of the focuses was on operational matters, including problem gambling.
Yes.
What do you understand to be meant by the term problem gambling?
people who gamble and get themselves into financial trouble because they become addicted and are unable to control their gambling.
How was it in the time that you were a member of the GWC that the GWC determined what was the extent of problem gambling? What was the basis by which they gathered information as to the problem?
I don't know that we ever did. I think there was a general awareness in the community that problem gambling existed, and you know, people like Tim Costello and many others have highlighted that throughout the country. So there was never any suggestion that it wasn't happening, and we sort of sought to take measures to minimise this. You know, for example, when Crown wanted to put an ATM in a certain place close to the gaming floor, we didn't allow that. And I know it goes back to the very early days of selection of a casino, by the way, that one of the issues that the casino subcommittee looked at was the issue of whether we would allow what were referred to as flytrap casinos, where a flytrap casino is where a hotel has gaming machines in the lobby. And we absolutely insisted that we would only allow a casino where the gaming floors were separate from the hotel and a gambler had to make a deliberate decision to go to the gambling floor. So there was that general awareness of problem gambling. I don't know that I can recall us ever gathering stats to identify how many problem gamblers there were.
And you may have already answered this question with what you've just said, but in relation to things, for example, like helplines that gamblers may have made use of, did the GWC ever seek data from providers of services like that? Or was it more based on a general understanding of problem gambling, as you've said before, such as Tim Costello?
We may well have gained some information. I'm struggling to recall the details of that.
Can we call up, please, gwc.002.0016.001 and go to page 108? And this is one of the agenda items for a agenda document that we've looked at before today. You can see that this one is in relation to summary of gaming action.
Yes.
Is that format of document familiar to you?
Yes.
And did you regularly see these sorts of documents showing you the gaming turnover?
Yes.
Now, is the amount of taxation revenue that's earned by the state linked to the amount of revenue that's earned by the casino?
I understand that it is, and these documents quite often used to actually indicate the amount of casino tax payable.
So if we can go to pages 115 and 116 and have those side by side, please. And you can see these show the casino tax that you calculate month by month and cumulative over the course of the year.
Correct.
Did the GWC closely track the amount of gambling revenues and therefore tax revenues to make sure that all relevant taxes were being paid?
We certainly noted these documents at every month. That's probably as much as I could say.
And again, in your time as a GWC member, was it generally considered to be a positive thing that there be increasing amounts of revenue gained, because that would then translate to increasing state revenues as well?
We were conscious of the impact on the state budget, but I don't think we ever considered that to be our prime concern.
And would you agree that if there's going to be an increase in gaming revenues, it'll be due either to the fact that there are perhaps more people gaming in any given time period, or that the amount of money being lost by the same number of people in a time period is increasing?
Yes, I suppose.
And so my question is, in relation to these concerns about problem gaming, how did the GWC balance the tension between, on the one hand, the profitability of the casino and the benefit to state coffers, but on the other hand, the potential issues of problem gaming of which the GWC was aware?
Well, everything in public life's a compromise, and we were very conscious of both sides of that issue, and we always looked to see that the gambler was getting a fair go. You know, in cases, for example, where machines were not returning the the requisite amount to the gambler that they should have been, and that sort of thing. So it was a balancing act, trying to, on one hand, do the right thing by everybody in the community, including the problem gamblers, and at the same time be conscious that the state was benefiting.
And again, with those problem gamblers, it was the case that the GWC was doing its best to estimate who they might be because you didn't have any specific data as to who they might be. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right, thank you. No further questions, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Ms. Seward?
Thank you. Just a few questions, Mr. Carr. You were asked a series of questions about the meetings of the GWC, and I think your answers included various papers were prepared by the departmental officers and delivered to Commission members for them to consider. During the course of those meetings, if any of the Commission members had any questions about those papers, were they able to raise them?
Oh, yes, yes.
And the various types of papers that were presented, was it common to receive updates on the work that the departmental officers had been doing in the previous month?
Only really where they related to specific agenda items.
Yes, so would one of those agenda items sometimes be a report on the audits and inspections that had been carried out in the previous month?
Oh, yes, yes.
And there was a matters to be action section in the agendas which would update on some of the matters that the department officers were still working on?
Possibly, I'm not sure.
If we were to go through the minutes and the agenda papers and we find a section on, I'll rephrase that. Would you expect those things to be recorded in the minutes if they had occurred?
If there was something where we had requested action by the department, we would expect to be advised of it.
And if there had been a standard item that the chairman, for example, had given an update on the work that had been done, you would expect to see that recorded if that update had been provided?
Yes.
And was one of the other matters that sometimes came before the Commission would be an update financial report on various points during the year, and that would explain how the budget was progressing at each point that you received the update?
Yes.
And then once a year there would be the annual budget for the next year presented for the Commission to consider.
Yes.
And if any of the members had any questions about the various calculations and numbers, there would be someone there who could answer those questions.
Well, there's certainly scope to ask the questions, yes.
And the annual report would need to be prepared once a year as well.
Yes.
And a draft annual report would be provided for the Commission to consider.
Possibly.
No further questions.
Is it anyone else? Is there any other party that wishes to cross-examine? No?
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Just one question. Mr. Carr, in relation to that last issue of problem gambling, do you remember a committee called the Problem Gambling Support Services Committee?
Sorry, no.
Do you remember if the GWC had any committee which reported to it about services for problem gamblers?
I don't believe so.
Thank you, that was all.
Thank you.
Just one, you, when you were first appointed, the then minister approached you, and I think your words were that she wanted someone to represent the community interests. I want to ask you what you understood by that term, community interest, and also whether or not you use, there's another phrase, public interest, and whether you see the terms as interchangeable. But can I, given that, and also in the context of the work that you then understood about the Gaming and Wagering Commission, what did you understand to be the community interests?
Well, I guess representing the general point of view of the average member of the community, to have some understanding of what the community expects and to be able to respond to that. And I guess having had a number of years in public office, I felt that I had some understanding of what is acceptable to the community at large.
And the public interest?
I would have seen the two as very, very similar.
All right, thank you. Mr. Lees, anything arising from that?
No, thank you, Commissioner.
All right. Mr. Carr, thank you very much for your assistance. That has helped us, and you are now free to go, and we will adjourn and reconvene at 10 a.m.